My name is Erik, and I'm a political scientist. It's been about 587 days since I ran my last regression. Jokes about alcoholism are perhaps a little bit tasteless. But the point remains here, I think, that political scientists, those people who are supposed to be studying democracy, they have a disease. And it's a disease that's expressed through demanding categories that work everywhere and demanding knowledge that can be represented in an indicator of statistical significance. Part of the problem, I think, is that only objective facts are taken seriously, as if subjective information just weren't relevant. I think there's a profound naivete here, and I think it prevents political science from understanding democracy today. So I'm happy to be here at a humanities conference, sat on a panel that deals with democracy. The study of democracy needs this humanistic touch. It needs to start with investigations into the meanings that people give their actions. I think this is the domain of culture, art, language, theater, and communication. The iconoclast economist Albert Hirschman famously trespassed into the political realm in order to help understand economic phenomena. Today, there is vast space and need, I would say, for trespassing into the humanities in order to understand the political. I'm no Hirschman, but I am trying to draw in his spirit and offering some comments here. Democracy can be defined objectively as a system of rule. I think that's all well and good. But democracy is also a reflexive category. People who talk about it bestow it with meanings. Those meanings then drive how they communicate and coordinate with others. And lo and behold, that coordination goes on to have real effects in the world. In any cultural milieu, democracy is going to take multiple meanings. Today, I'm going to vastly oversimplify, but I'm hoping that the nets that I cast here catch some fish. What I'd like to do is to take two meanings of democracy here in Korea and trace how they've shifted over time, see how these meanings get used, and see where that leaves us in understanding Korean politics today. I'm going to call the first meaning a cynical one, and the second a celebratory or optimistic one. And I'm not going to tell this audience, unfortunately, anything that you don't already know, but I'll try to package it in a different way. I should mention here that I also owe some intellectual debt to my colleague, Prof. Chung Young-sup, in sociology, whose work helps me understand how structures and terms relate to underlying forces and how these things get layered over time, though he's absolved for anything in this presentation. The language and symbols of democracy entered Korea as an external imposition. Americans helped create for Koreans a liberal constitution for a highly illiberal period. Korean rulers needed to show Americans that they were all right, at least not communist, and Americans were happy not to bother so much. This was a show. It was a performance. Koreans performed for Americans and for themselves, and Americans on some level also knew that this was a show. Democracy, again, as a subjective category, meant a signal, a performance. The real meaning was, let's put on this show while we get on with the real business of the day. In 1948-49, that meant counter-revolutionary state building and consolidating a particular social class's grip on increasingly centralized control over violence. In the 1950s, it was a modified version of the same. In the 1960s, it was a modernizing project. Those were the real meanings. Democracy was deployed cynically for anti-democratic purposes. That is, there was no serious belief in the principles and symbols that were showcased. Democratic statements were made to justify and obscure, by the same token, actions that cut people out of politics or otherwise used state coercion to threaten critics. And that is the core of this cynicism. From the beginning, all the liberal language was not taken seriously. That's why I'm calling it cynical. It's a deliberate pretense. Nonetheless, keeping up the show, keeping up that pretense was crucial for engaging in the real projects. And all the stuff that came with democracy was infused with the same spirit. Rights in the Constitution, even the idea of a liberal constitution in the first place, elections, electoral parties, and so on. I think it would be a mistake to see all of these things as only authoritarian manipulations. And that is because they created meanings that were used for real human communication. And those meanings led to real violence and betrayal among people. Democracy and things associated with it could become code for accepted forms of antisocial violence. Even as Korea democratized, the cynical interpretation of democracy did not disappear. Among the most common tactics was casting doubt on the patriotism of particular people or positions so as to discredit their participation in politics, as we all know. Labeling someone a communist or leftist was not just a slur, it came with or comes with an understood threat of violence, just as racism does in places where racial groups have sustained violence in the past. Those threats are lurking behind those terms. Now, fortunately, another meaning of democracy arose. This one celebrates the political as a way to fight injustice and pursue collective visions. Let me suggest one starting point for this meaning, although I think others might be chosen. And this would be the social and political movements of the 1970s and 1980s. As Professor Lee here has demonstrated and documented for us, these movements articulated alternative visions and stories of the nation. They were also diverse, with varying demands for labor rights, for political rights, greater national autonomy, or unification. Democracy was one word among many. What activists agreed upon, and what I would like to stress here, is the celebration of politics, of organizing together to pursue a collective vision. And these movements contributed, of course, to bringing about democracy as a system of rule by the late 1980s. As dictatorship-era activists migrated into party politics and so-called civil society, their celebratory spirit continued to infuse political engagement. Democracy, in this view, is not just about or primarily about voting. It's about being informed, engaged, and participating in demonstrations when needed. The celebratory aspects of this meaning of democracy became clearer with the onset in 2002 of candlelight protests. These events clearly put the celebratory, optimistic spirit into political engagement. The nature of movement politics shifted across this series of candlelight protests from 2002 to 2004 to 2008, up to their culmination in 2016-17 in the candlelight movement. By the time of this last set, now some 6 years ago, multiple trends had crystallized. Let me put these briefly. There was a symbolic shift in movement politics, away from ideological study to a recognition of pluralism and a diverse set of vulnerabilities, needs, and desires being addressed. Maybe there's something parallel to what we heard in the previous presentation about diversification in movements. There was an organizational shift away from hierarchical organization, away from senior-junior dyads as the mobilizing basis in an earlier period, to more horizontal, decentralized modes of mobilization. There was a shift in the types of media that helped to propagate ideas, from bootleg presses to podcasters. And there are other changes too, demographic changes and so on. I think there's a huge amount one could say about any one of these points. All I want to underscore here is that candlelight protests have made political engagement quite different to the 1980s. But the celebratory spirit, the embrace of the political, I think that has remained. The protests of the 1980s are also remembered in terms of democracy, thanks to the work of bodies like the Korea Democracy Foundation that have reinterpreted earlier movements in the frame of democratization. Here on the SNU campus, you can take this democracy walk to revisit these plaques that talk about activists who are associated with the university. This is part of that remembering. I think there's a fascinating layering to these movements as well. One protest recalls a previous one, re-remembering it in different terms. I found here that memory studies are quite helpful in casting light on what is going on in protests. And I think if you attend a candlelight rally, it's an exercise in trying to decode these layers. Now, by 2017, 2018, I think we had a pretty amazing political landscape here in Korea. There was a sense of empowerment and optimism that people could make changes through politics. Public forums oozed confidence in searching for ways to build and improve Korean democracy. And there was a kind of a rejection or going beyond any external models. This was, we can do this for ourselves. And all of this was happening against a global context in which mass political engagement looked gloomy, if not downright dangerous. President Moon's administration was given the mandate to build on this engagement. It was a chance to use the celebratory spirit, not just to denounce, but to build. Authority could be constructed then on new grounds. This moment was an historic one. President Moon had some success, and then cynicism returned. Despite everything, cynicism returned. Forces seeking to obstruct plans to reorient the Korean state snuck back in. I call these forces anti-democratic because their aims have been to halt projects that would deepen accountability and fairness. They did a number of things. For one, they returned to the old themes of labeling their opponents as communists. For another, they appropriated the symbols and styles of their opponents. They railed against dictatorship, even as they sought to stop efforts to de-authoritarianize the state. What could possibly be more cynical than that? More recently, they've turned to gender-based hate in the name of justice. Another thing these forces did, and this is the one I'd like to emphasize a bit here, was to take over narratives of fairness and corruption. The anti-democratic forces worked to subvert initiatives to make society fairer by fabricating and exaggerating charges of injustice toward the person charged with helping reform judicial institutions. To reiterate, these forces drew attention to alleged wrongdoing by one person in order to shut down a whole project of making society fairer. This was a work of misdirection, and it was dripping in cynicism. The move was also brilliant. It gave the media a new lease on life. It gave the disgruntled a simple story and a face on which to project their resentment and jealousy. It even tricked the left, thereby splitting the forces that celebrate politics. There seems to be something of a normative crisis now in Korea, centered on these issues of justice and fairness. On one hand, leaders seeking to deepen democracy can be persecuted for the slightest appearance of possible wrongdoing. On the other hand, their opponents' deep abuse of power can be overlooked as being just what politicians do. And a similar thing is playing out on a mass level. We're now in a society where the formula that legitimized variation in levels of life success has been smashed. It's now hard to figure out what justifies why I've done poorly and you have done well. In this context, I think we've seen the expression of bizarre, borderline nihilistic viewpoints about who deserves what in society. And the cynics, they've preyed on this moment of normative ambiguity to confuse. Cynics have proved themselves very good at obstruction. Now they've proved themselves more than relevant electorally. These cynics exploit a loophole in democracy. Democracy seems to encourage all points of view, but it's also possible for anti-democratic perspectives to gain refuge. In the interwar period in Europe, militant democracy was proposed as a solution to this loophole. If you have anti-democratic parties, then you should perhaps ban them. Debates over militant democracy informed post-war European constitution building. And the Korean constitution, by the way, also has a militant democracy clause adopted in the most cynical way, but that's another story. The problem here with cynicism today is similar. Cynics pretend to champion democratic causes while actually working to make democratic institutions as meaningless as possible. They're not seeking a formal coup, but to dominate without needing a coup. And I think Korean Humanities can help us to understand this cynical challenge to democracy. I'm wrapping up here. My talk is relatively brief, but I don't want to end pessimistically. I think I can end actually rather optimistically, as I should. The optimistic celebratory spirit in democracy in Korea is astounding. Other democracies can learn it. Anglo-American societies, for instance, are stuck in tropes of the self-serving politician. Civic-minded people denigrate politics instead of celebrating it. They retreat into a frustration with elected officials, or worse, pine for effective autocrats. I think they ought to look to Korea to rediscover the celebration of the political. We need people who can tell stories about Korea's democracy to the outside world. That task requires a fluency in understanding the symbols in Korea and also in how to present them to external audiences. A humanistic touch is needed for that. We also need foreign audiences who can overcome their own imperial biases or their own parochialism. I once wrote a book about democracy in Korea. I couldn't convince anyone outside the Korea field that it was a book about democracy. For them, it was a book about Korea, and those two things are different. But I'm actually quite positive that we're nearly there. I think someday soon, someone will write on democracy in Korea, and people out there will see it as a reflection, as an engagement on the subject of democracy. Finally, another reason to be optimistic. A lot of what I'm saying here, a lot of what I'm talking about is about story making. If making stories can have such an impact, how you present a narrative, then by recrafting narratives, we can also make change. And I think that should be empowering. It's also far more optimistic than the mainstream view. If the divisions that I have described in Korean politics and society emanate from some polarization of Korean society, then there's little we can do about that. But polarization presupposes a lot of certainty. What I see, though, is a high degree of uncertainty, of normative uncertainty. I do not believe Korea is a polarized society, even though there are people who wish it were. And that is hopeful. Interpretations and understandings are sources of change. Creating, retelling stories, these can shape the future. And this is the domain of the humanities. We need students of literature, theater, media, communication in order to understand the politics and also to change it. And so that's what I think studies of Korean democracy can contribute to the world. Thank you.